Hello students, Mr. Young here with World Studies. Chapter 20, Lesson 3 is called The Reformation Begins, and this is a long lesson, kids. It's all about how many of the different splinters of Christianity formed. Now I'm going to simplify it to make it all fit in a day, but here's today's lesson in a comically short summary. The church was a big corrupt monopoly, and people were miffed. Erasmus and Christian humanists wanted to return to the basics. Martin Luther was an angry monk and nailed his complaints to the door of a monastery and made a new religion, Protestantism. And the King of England made the Anglican Church because the Pope wouldn't let him divorce his wife for a sweet young thing so he could make more babies. So he made his own church that would. And Calvinists think God already chose who's going to heaven. And that's today's lesson. Let's talk about it. Okay, time for the abridged version, but not the comically short version again. So the church has been growing too big for its britches for a while now. The Renaissance was a time of thinking, reflecting, and what would become the Reformation of the church. Initially, people wanted only to reform the Roman Catholic Church, fix it, make it better. But what we'll learn is it ended up splitting up into multiple factions. Now, some major problems with the church was its upper hierarchy were living like kings, and many of the regular Joe Schmoes were still dirt poor. Even the local priests could barely read the Bible in their shack of a church. But hey, the bishop lives in a palace down the road and takes communion from a golden chalice. Harumph. There was also perhaps the most famous of Catholic church vices, indulgences. Indulgences were the practice of essentially buying pardons for your sins. So like, I killed someone, but I'm rich, so I'm going to donate a bunch of money to the church and they will grant me forgiveness. Indulgence. So the church made some big money selling forgiveness to rich folks. People didn't like that. John Wycliffe didn't like that, and he's famous because, he preached that Jesus was the real head of the church, not the Pope, and that you could find truth from just reading the Bible. You didn't have to listen to like the upper hierarchy of the church. He thought everyone should be able to read the Bible, and so he started translating it into English, and then when he died, his followers finished the job. This was the first time that was done. Before that, it was all written in Latin, so if you couldn't read Latin, you couldn't tell what the Bible said, and you had to rely on people that basically like the upper class and the clergy to tell you what the Bible said, because they were the only ones that could read Latin. There was another guy by the name of Erasmus who was a Christian humanist. These folks were loyal to the Catholic Church and wanted to restore it to its more simpler times. He thought you needed to be good in your everyday life, and he criticized the wealth of the church in his 1509 book, Praise of Folly. Oh, Martin Luther. Martin Luther in a nutshell. Hold on to your pants. Martin Luther was a German monk born in 1483. He went to visit Rome one time, and he saw that all the people there were acting the fool, living opulent lives, and being disrespectful to God. He went home ticked off. Then the straw really broke the camel's back for Martin Luther when the Pope himself started selling indulgences. What he did was he sent a bunch of monks out to sell indulgences so that he could rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, big church. So, Martin Luther was so angry that he nailed 95 complaints to the door of the local cathedral where he was at, and he sent copies to the bishops. They were copied and sent all over the place. This document is called the 95 Thesis, and this basically got him excommunicated from the church. But he wouldn't budge. He refused to give up, and it really formed the first sect of Protestantism, known as Lutheranism, named after Martin Luther, of course. So why did Lutheranism survive in a time when the church crushed heresy under its boot like a bug? It was supported by some nobles, that's why. Some Germanic nobles. It basically got tied into politics and therefore survived. So this was all happening in Germany. This is a Holy Roman Empire at the time. Charles V is a Holy Roman Emperor, and his nobles used Lutheranism as a vehicle by which to rebel. They didn't like Charles V, so they became Lutherans and stopped paying taxes to the Catholic Church, and they started to keep those taxes for their own kingdoms. there was a war, Charles V versus these rebelling Lutheran nobles, but Charles V couldn't take them out. There was an agreement at the end called the Peace of Augsburg. Basically, they decided the ruler of a territory could decide what religion that territory would be. So the Lutherans got to stay Lutheran, the Catholics got to stay Catholic. As a result, North Germany ended up being Protestant, and South Germany ended up being Roman Catholic, and this divide still exists today. You can see here. Okay, John Calvin in a paragraph. John Calvin was a Frenchman born in France, 1509. He was one smart dude, and smart enough to leave France and head for Switzerland when he knew it was too dangerous to be talking about Protestantism in France. That was a good way to get shivved in the street. You'd get killed. Once there, he basically came up with his own religion, similar to Luther's, but there were some differences. We won't talk about it in too much depth because this is world studies, not theology. But the big idea you need to know about Calvinism is predestination. Basically, they thought God knows everything. He knows everything that's going to happen, so he already knows who's going to go to heaven, who's going to go to hell. Therefore, the afterlife is already predetermined. Predestination. So most of his followers of John Calvin figured they were on the good list and they were going to go to heaven. They were predestined to go to heaven. And they actually kind of acted like it. They were very hardworking and industrious people. They tended to follow the laws of the communities in which they lived. They also had this thing where they elected their church leaders. They weren't chosen or appointed, which is like a little slice of democracy in a time of, well, not democracy. These Calvinist ideals of hard work and democracy would become trademarks of American culture. Oh, and then we get to the Anglican Church. Some real soap opera business here. So Henry VIII of England had a problem. His wife Catherine only bore him one daughter, Mary. All the rest died. And that's no good because he needed a male heir to continue his Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII was a Tudor. Catherine wasn't getting any younger, and old Henry had the hots for a younger noblewoman, Anne Boleyn. Divorce wasn't allowed, so he asked the Pope to annul the marriage. Just declare the whole thing null and void like a bad check where you misspelled Cat Fancy Magazine, and so you just cancel the whole thing. Cancel that sucker. The problem is the Pope wouldn't do it. He would not annul the marriage. He basically didn't want to tick off Henry's in-laws, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Remember, they made the notorious Spanish Inquisition that killed all the people that were heretics. So that was probably a good move by the Pope. Also, Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, so the Pope didn't want to be on his blacklist either. So Henry had the Archbishop in England annul the marriage, so the Pope excommunicated Henry. Henry and the Parliament went ahead and made their own church, the Anglican Church. Some priests and church officials that refused to switch to Anglican were then killed. Henry divided the Catholic Church's property among his nobles. One final insult to the Pope. Henry then married the young Anne Boleyn. There he is, Henry VIII. He's going to make his own religion that's better. Alright, I'd like to order a Bloody Mary. Hold the blood, please. I guess Henry's plan didn't fire off the way he thought, because that surviving daughter by him and Catherine became queen when Henry died. She was now Queen Mary, and she was Roman Catholic, and switched England back to a Roman Catholic country. Those that refused to comply were burned at the stake. The population didn't care for that much, and she became known as Bloody Mary. There's a whole lot more in that, but we're not going to go into details. You can look it up in your own time if you like. Mary got sick and died in 1558. Her half-brother, Elizabeth, born to Henry by the young one, Anne Boleyn, became queen and switched the country back to Anglican. Elizabeth is considered one of the best rulers of England ever. Period. They love her. They love Elizabeth. A quick note on the Anglican religion. It is considered one of the Protestant religions. It accepted some, but not all, of Martin Luther's teachings. But the ceremonies are very Roman Catholic in nature. They kept a lot of the pomp and appearance. Fun fact to finish it up, the Calvinists, remember John Calvin, predestination? They made their way up into England too. They wanted to reform the Anglican Church to purify it. Hence they became known as Puritans, and they were generally disliked in England. They would end up packing it up and leaving for America in the not too distant future. And we'll learn all about that next year. Alright, that's the lesson. That's quite a bit there, isn't it? Whew. Okay. So there were some pretty crazy events happening in this lesson. The Catholic Church was just cruising along, and then bam! All of a sudden, multiple splinter factions of Christianity. Go ahead and answer these questions with complete sentences, please. What were some issues that caused people to want to reform or break away from the Roman Catholic Church? How did Lutheranism not get crushed by the Roman Catholic Church? And how and why was the Anglican Church created? That's a fun one. Alright, 10 points, basically 3 points per question, and I'll tag you 1 point on grammar and punctuation. That's it. Tomorrow, lesson 4, Catholics and Protestants, they're fighting each other. Not a good situation. Alright, have a good day. Let me know if you need anything.